As a boy, I grew up in the plantation country of east central Georgia, Richmond County, that nest of counties that were Georgia's first urban area, but also the first of the plantation districts in Georgia. You know, this is an area up here that is sort of late in terms of having plantations. There really aren't many up here because it's not really cotton-producing country. The heart of the cotton country was down along the fall line, and it stretched all the way from Augusta over into the general area of Columbus and also down to Americus and Thomasville in the southwest quarter of the state. And so the plantations I'm going to be talking about today are in that part of the world, the southwestern part of the state, Thomas County primarily, which is the county that adjoins Leon County and Tallahassee. There is an institute of proclaimed higher education there, but I'm not going to advocate for them today. I grew up hunting. I grew up as a boy in the fields of sedge that had gone fallow because of the Depression. And that is a fascinating story to me and a subject for another talk sometimes, the vanishing towns of Georgia, where I was born, in fact. You know, as you get older, I like to think positively, but at the same time, I live in the twilight world of memory, keeping careful notes of those things that are too painful to remember, but too precious to forget. Find yourself in land sometimes. I want to read you a little piece I wrote about hunting in that post-Depression era in these old abandoned fields and farmers who in turn had been abandoned as well. God, I miss the old men and their guns, their curled black and white photos of their dogs, their stories of the woods, their dogs gulping air out of the side window of their rust-encrusted trucks. The way they greeted each other. I remember the dust was red and beggar lice clung to our pants. The truck smelled of waxed waterproof jackets and gun oil. Winding along dirt roads, we eased out into an abandoned field. Ain't this the place we came last year when Pump shot the ground dove and it fell in his lap? Quivering dogs leaped from the back of the truck, pointers mad with eagerness and scent, their breath billowing in frigid dawn air, golden fields of sedge, black-barked pines and scrub oaks, sandy dirt, rows of dead cotton stalks. Their guns are old Winchester, Remington, and Ithaca pump guns. Their shells are low brass with red paper husks. They wear bib overalls and flannel shirts, canvas caps, and the same high-top shoes they plowed in. Without dogs, we would have to follow the fence rows, hoping birds would rise from cover. Dogs were better. The dogs could sweep the field, coursing back and forth, frenzied, electric. They would stop, freeze at a point on a covey, the birds frozen to the ground by instinct, the dogs trained to wait on the hunter. Sometimes even seasoned dogs were unable to stand it. I've seen them grab a bird in midair. Hard to break them of that once they know they can do this. Quail would rise in an explosion of pounding feathers, 2 or 3 dozen in a covey, and the sound would set our hearts to racing as we recited the lessons. Point on a single bird, lead the bird, hold the gun tight on your cheek, squeeze the trigger, never leave a wounded bird in the brush. Eat what you kill, never shoot a bird on the ground or in a tree. Keep your gun up, don't shoot the dog, don't shoot anybody. Praise your dog when it retrieves the downed bird. 3 shots, only wound. Don't hunt down the strays elsewhere this day. Remember this day, this sunset, this covey rise, this favorite gun, the feel of a feathery life in your gentle grasp at its last shudder. So I grew up in a world that, hunting was familiar to me when I made this job change. Thomas County is sort of the quail capital of the world. And just out of the blue, I had an offer to go and manage a plantation that was being turned into a museum and really a scientific research center too, dealing with pine trees and bobwhite quail. How many of you know what a bobwhite quail is? Oh, good, there are some of you, great. Let's see if I can get this to work. I think I was chosen, the director of the several famous museums turned the job down cold, and they didn't tell me that until later. But I was a Southerner, and I think that played a role in it. This is my great-great-grandfather, who was a member of Cobb's Legion, and my great-great-grandfather on the other side of my family, who was in the Georgia militia in the 1890s. My parents walking across the street in cold downtown Augusta. My father was an engineer, drafted into the Army. I was, as they say, my father's revenge for Pearl Harbor. But that's my lovely mother. And after leaving graduate school, I attended the University of Georgia. I attended there for my graduate studies. But this is a house I lived in. It's on Lee Street in Americus. Am I a Southerner or what? None of my families lived outside the state that I'm aware of since 1739 or so. Wow. That explains a lot, doesn't it? The part of the world that I'm taking you to is the Red Clay Hills of southwest Georgia in the heart of the longleaf pine forest. This is not a great map to use, but it's the best I could find. The yellow square marks the area that covers the plantations of southwest Georgia and northwest Florida. This is a unique environment of longleaf pines, and excuse me. What defines the region is the way the pine trees grow. They are tall, they're majestic. DeSoto comments on them when he arrives in the southeast. He's amazed at these great deserts of pines. These are not the pines you see here, where they're all clustered in a bunch, and where you couldn't throw a rock through the woods. These trees stand at great distances from each other because they're very heavy feeders on the soil, and the soil is thin. And so that kind of explains it. There's an effort to revive the longleaf pine up in this region, going on more over toward Rome. So it's a unique environment, and that will explain why people choose to come here. We often think of our own times as the most troubled political times in our nation's history. They are not. They are not. We've been through two major revolutions in the United States, one to win independence from England and the other one to win independence from New England. That's just a joke. You like that, didn't you? I can tell the Southerners. I can tell you. This is a map of the plantations in Thomas County. They are antebellum plantations that fell apart after the Civil War and were bought up by wealthy Yankees. Many of them are from Cleveland. In fact, a third of the plantations in Thomas County belong to one family. The largest plantation in the area belongs to one of that family, 53,000 acres, one place. And its sole purpose is to shoot quail. You cannot pay to shoot on these plantations private. They're all private reserves. How can this be in this age and day, and why did they come about? Well, not everybody in Thomasville would agree with me when I tell you this part of the story. In the troubled age of the 19th century, after the American excuse me, another miscue there, after the Southern Rebellion against the North, Southern plantations collapsed because they had run out of labor resources, and also there were problems with with cotton, the type of cotton that was grown, the unavailability of fertilizer, and so on. But what is most interesting, I think, is between 1886 and 1896, in fact, let's back up to 1876. From 1876 to 1896, no president elected was more than a minority president. Did you know that? That is, they got less than half of the popular vote. Well, that led me on to wonder, well, who in the heck are the guys that scored so big? It amazed us. The highest scoring presidents are Warren G. Harding, one of our worst, 60%. Lyndon Baines Johnson. I didn't hear any applause for that either. But the point is, all during the late 19th century, there's tremendous friction in America. The Democratic Party nearly, in fact, it did win the popular vote in 1876, and the Republicans are in despair. They have to make amends with the South after having defeated them. I wish they'd just sent a check. There are serious labor disturbances in the major cities that accompany the rise of industry in the late 19th century. Cleveland is becoming the financial capital of the United States, largely on the basis of the rise of Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the most enormous and complicated financial institution, I guess, in the world at the time. This is interesting, too. The 1900 economic census showed that there were only 1,000 millionaires in the United States. So we're always whining about the 1%. They weren't 1/100th of 100%. And they own probably 90% of all the manufacturing and financial institutions in the country. There's violence. There's violence in the Haymarket disaster in Chicago, and a little later on another disaster at the Pullman Works, where the Pullman cars are manufactured, also near Chicago. The story of how capital came to deal with these kind of labor disturbances is a subject for another talk sometime, I suppose. But it's fascinating how that happened. In the meantime, many of these people chose to find sanctuaries for themselves and their families outside of violent areas. It also happened they got away from the cold, too, in some cases. A good reason to leave Cleveland in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. Think about it. Where do the New York folks go? Nah, you couldn't get there on a train. There were no planes. And it was full of diseases, too, by the way. You could come down with yellow fever just by going fishing in Florida. You still can, I would think. Did I ask a question? Yeah. Did I ask? What was the question?
Where are the New Yorkers?
Where'd they go?
They took over Maine. If you go into Maine, everywhere you go there, you'll find somebody whining about, well, we don't own any beaches anymore. We don't own any of the offshore islands. We don't own anything up here. I went to a board meeting in Maine one year for this family I worked for, and I arrived there, and I'm a sailor, and I looked at the yachts parked in the little harbor there, and I said, goodness, whose yachts are all of these? They said, embarrassedly and admittedly, they said, they all belong to us. They all belong to us. So, are you familiar with the term love-hate relationships? Envy can do terrible things to you, can't it? One of the early purchasers of land in the Thomasville area who came from this environment I've just described in Cleveland, the domain of Standard Oil, really, was Howard Melville Hanna. Howard Melville Hanna bought a plantation that included Pebble Hill, which is where I worked. And I have to tell you that this is amazing to me. They bought this house, they expanded it triple fold. It burned down, they built another one. But in the meantime, they had built one just like the first one off in the woods, because this house was designed by John Wynn, the first architect to practice in southwest Georgia, and his, sort of historical figure. But even though this house would burn down, you can still go see the one out in the woods. It's not open to the public. Howard Melville Hanna had a brother who was deeply enmeshed in politics. Some of you may guess who he is. This is modern-day Pebble Hill. The Via West Point. I was just telling someone that the summer before I had attended West Point for a military history class, and I was all confused about what I was going to do next in my career when this opportunity came along. Howard Melville Hanna would leave this plantation to his daughter and subsequently to his granddaughter. Mainly during the daughter's tenure here, ownership, that everything was built. And most of what is added to Pebble Hill, and this is fascinating, the 19-teens, the war years, and the years that followed it in the 1920s, were an era when those who had a little money put everything else in their pocket too. The war turned on the economic engine of America for the profit of very few people. This is one thing we often miss. The cotton prices even recovered, at least for a short time. If you make cordite for weapons, explosives, you've got to have cotton. That's what makes it burn more completely and do the most damage. So if you look down on this map of Pebble Hill, which I was handed the day of my interview, by the way, my interview was in the main house, at a breakfast table surrounded by elephantine Audubon prints that were worth $30,000 to $50,000 a piece. If I'd known that then, I wouldn't have been nervous. You can see in the upper left-hand corner is a gigantic stable cow barn. It was used first for a Jersey herd. And I just discovered why they built it. They passed the income tax amendment. And the hole in that donut was anything you spent on your business was deductible from your taxes. And so all of these plantation owners began building things that would supplement their excuse for holding these great hunting plantations. In the lower right is the main house itself. It's 330 feet long, 23 bedrooms, each with its own bath, full of every kind of imaginable antique. Nearer me, the big white dot in the middle, you can see the formal, or the gardens in front. I'll show you some moment. They built this house for Mr. Sparrow, who was the first manager of Pebble Hill. I'll show you what they did for me in a moment. This is a picture of Euclid's Millionaires Row in Cleveland, one of the richest districts in America, and said to rival the homes on any street in the world, much less in America. And this is Leonard Hanna's home on Euclid Avenue. Yeah. And this is the general public impression of where all this money came from Standard Oil. This is a famous cartoon showing the tentacles of Standard Oil reaching out in all kinds of directions. You cannot imagine the wealth the Rockefellers held, but it's even more complicated when you extend that network out to all of those families who were early investors in Standard Oil and who reaped generations of millions of dollars from this. I love this cartoon. Rockefeller spent the rest of his life being a sort of philanthropist or a real philanthropist, and his children have done brilliant things for our country, and certainly to be praised for that. Any of you know what a Rockefeller Republican is? Darn, I am older than you. A Rockefeller Republican supported Nelson Rockefeller when he was running for president against Richard Nixon. Got you on that one, didn't he? Well, I want to talk just a moment about this crisis in America and how it comes to focus on the little town of Thomasville and the plantations there. Mark Hanna rented a townhouse in Thomasville. He used his brother's plantation to hunt, and he had made his fortune off the streetcar business in Cleveland, and was an investor in Standard Oil and many other ventures as well, as was Howard Melville Hanna. And they had their pets. They're people they thought, if we back these people, they will do for us what needs to be done to maintain the independence of capital and crush those who are opposed to it. The penultimate person, of course, is President William McKinley. McKinley came to Thomasville in 1896 and was feted there and shown about, and at that point he was $80,000 in debt, which in 1896 would amount to what, I don't know, $80 million today. Great deal of money. Standard Oil bailed him out. Who paid him was John D. Archbold, who was the president of Standard Oil. And the president of Standard Oil also gave the money for the hospital in Thomasville, which is called the John D. Archbold Hospital today, one of the few really thriving hospitals in a rural community. Beside him is a man some of you may know. Any of you recognize the guy on the right of McKinley?
Theodore.
Pardon?
Theodore.
That's my man, Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a wild buckaroo in their perspective, but it didn't matter. He was going to be vice president. What can he do? Well, McKinley fooled around and got himself shot, and Teddy became president, and the shoe was on the other foot. So be careful. Be careful. When Hanna was brought the new president to Thomasville, or the president-to-be, what was happening there that is missed by almost everybody who looks at this subject, and that is capital was moving into politics. They were buying politicians, and some would say the presidency. Well, let's leave the grim behind for a moment and talk just a little bit about the Hannas and their role in Thomasville. This is the daughter in the center of Howard Melville Hanna. Hanna owned a huge plantation. He returned part of it, which was called the Pebble Hill section, to his daughter when she married and had children. And so Kate begins to build all those structures that you see. She builds an enormous, where I lived up on the hill, there was a barn for cutting wood to be used in all of the residences on the place that was bigger than this building. Beside her are her two children, and I'll talk more about the young man in a moment, but this is Pansy, as she was called. As you can see, both these women are extraordinarily attractive people and remarkable people in their own right, even without the money. So why the plantations? Why this particular locale? It is for southern hunting and fishing. There are great lakes around there, I mean enormous lakes, much bigger than we have here. And it was also convenient in this sense. You couldn't get to Florida. There was no railroad. When they began developing, also Florida doesn't offer the same opportunities for the sort of sporting life as we know it today. The things that we associate with the later sporting life that surround power boats and all, that all had not evolved yet. That was in the future. But they also could mix some of their interest into one site. They could come here in the winter, get away from the coal fires in Cleveland that smelled and suffocated people. They could get away from labor violence, which gets worse in the winter because people get damn mad in the winter when they don't have any money. I know I do. It was not far. In fact, it was en route between them and in Cleveland and Kentucky. And they also bought horse farms in Kentucky. And later they would buy a place in Maine as well. And so rich people do not live anywhere. They live in different places. Wouldn't you, if you could take advantage of the weather? You know, what do we have? 8 weeks of rain? It's time. I'm inviting you all to my place in Florida next. They were into all kinds of horsey set things, you know, competitive riding, polo, horse racing. But quail dominated the scene. It's a very gentlemanly sport. They take you out on a wagon. You're nicely dressed. In fact, you have a towel. And I've never seen any of them hunting without a towel on. They would go, this is right on into the 20th century. I mean, into the mid-20th century. Because that's the way they dressed. They might wear jodhpurs and expensive boots, but they had on a tie. Ride in the wagon, pulled by matching horses, usually a pair of mules. They like to use those too. And they would go out into the fields. Quail bunch up at night. They all come back together in a circle, and they keep their little bottoms toward each other in the middle. And as the weather warms the next morning, they spread out in all directions looking for food. They're omnivorous devils. They'll eat almost anything that pops up. But the fun thing about this is if you catch them when they're still down in their covey and the bird dogs point them, they're all going to get up at once in front of your guns. That's kind of how I feel coming in here today.
We had to check our guns at the door.
You know, I started to bring mine, Tom, knowing you were coming. This lifestyle is convergent, a convergence of many factors, and this would make another interesting talk, and I'm sort of working on this one. Why did upland hunting become so popular in the late 19th century as to justify buying 20, 30, 40, 50,000 acres of land to propagate that culture? Well, one thing was the standardization of dog breeds. We didn't have standardized dog breeds earlier than, I think, about 1885, somewhere along in there. The kennel clubs were organized. The environment is right because what had been most agricultural land is now open, is void, has grown up in pines, or has been kept clean for food crops. And my favorite part, the evolution of the shotgun. That's another topic, but I don't think I could get 20 people to hear that. The post-Civil War period, hunting had to be done with shotguns with Damascus barrels. They're made out of twisted wire, and when they get old or they're not kept or they were imperfectly made, they blow up in your face. That's a definite downer. Particularly so your first time, that'd be my luck. First time in the field, boom. Well, he was a nice guy. He looked better with his head, though. So we have all this money converging on all of this sort of coincidental factors that make shooting so popular in the late 19th century. It's considered from roughly 1890 up to, I don't know, 1925 or so. That's the golden age of American upland game shooting, bird shooting. And it's very, this is interesting. These people are Scots-Irish. That's another lecture, but I haven't given that yet. But they're Scots-Irish, but they put on English airs when they move south. And they take as their model the southern model of the aristocratic gentleman in the bow tie and with servants, black field hands, black everybody except the owners. When I got there, the families who were there and which continued to be employed there had been there since before Reconstruction. Many of them were slave families who had lived on the same plantation, which just blew me away, made a wonderful opportunity to learn from them and talk to them. You've seen this, how many of you have ever seen this picture before? Do you recognize it? It's in a lot of television shows. It's just used for background noise in love scenes. But that's not Kate Ireland, as you might think. That's the artist Alfred Munning's wife, pretty lady. He was president of the Royal Academy for a while. The Southern style to all this, they make adaptations, and one of the interesting adaptations is the English like to shoot birds and other game driven. You chase them off the fields on the other side of the hill, and they arrive where everybody's standing around with a shotgun and somebody else ready to hand them another loaded shotgun. Does that remind you of Downton Abbey? Yeah. Right, you should. This is Pansy Ireland Poe. She married Mr. Poe, and the turkeys are being driven out of the swamp, and they're shooting them. Pansy shot a 12-gauge shotgun. She was a little bitty woman, but her mother had brought her up on this gun, and she continued to use it all her life. And the man kneeling beside her, this is a painting which Mrs. Poe had commissioned by Aidan Ripley, who's a famous wildlife artist, or I should say sporting artist. So it becomes a sort of Yankee paradise to the locals. They think, well, these Yankees are a lot easier to pick than cotton. And they sold lands that were next to worthless to them to build these plantations. The plantations, unfortunately, took a lot of land out of production, and a lot of farmers complained about it. So they began renting out parcels of their land so that local farmers could grow produce and whatnot on it. But it was a very strictly regulated system. Who came to the plantation? Well, there are many plantation owners who are from New York, too, and I was trying not to mention them. Just kidding. In the top left is President George Humphrey, who was Secretary of the Treasury. George's son married the lady who was chairman of my board when I was at Pebble Hill, a very lovely lady named Louise Humphrey. Louise Humphrey was the one who owned the 53,000-acre estate. They had they even invited a few Democrats to stop by. You'll recognize Jimmy Carter is one of them. You may not recognize this Princess Marie of Greece, but that's who's in the bottom one. On the right-hand side, you may remember that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor came to America, but these folks didn't like him, and they had to issue an invitation anyway. And so the Duke and Duchess of Windsor came over to Valdosta on the train. She said, "I'm not going off in the bush with you. I'm going to stay here where there's a comfortable hotel." And she didn't realize that 5 of the best hotels in the country were in Thomasville. That's true, because Yankees came by the thousands for summer vacations there. Anyway, they took him out in the woods and put him on a turkey stand. And then they all went back to the house and drank and ate the rest of the day. And about sundown, they went back and picked him up. And the story is he was roaring mad and angry and insisted on being taken back to the train station so he could get back to Valdosta. So this is known as the flight to Valdosta. Just a bit of ecology to kind of catch you up on the end part of this. Longleaf pines don't just grow anywhere, and they used to cover all of these area into parts of New Jersey, all down through the coastal plain, all across Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, all the way out to Texas. And it was the richest timber industry in the world in the late 19th century, after the Civil War. After these lands became open for exploitation by timber companies. Among other things, when they cut them all down, they ruined the ecology of the region, and as you probably know, Savannah is collecting saline water in its water supply now because the pressure of fresh water coming into the Atlantic is so diminished that the salt water is backing up into Savannah. It's the worst thing since Sherman's. No, Sherman wasn't too hard on it, was he? The other phenomena there that always fascinated me and was worth writing about, I think, is how the forests are managed, and that is with prescriptive burning. We look around us today, and what we're here at is second, third, fourth growth forests that look like this. If they were burned regularly, that's not what they would look like. When you burn at a low temperature and low fire across a pine land, it kills the broadleaf trees. It kills the oaks. It kills all that scrubby stuff that comes up and leaves the stands of pine. The pine trees themselves, you can't regenerate a pine forest overnight. It takes 1,000,000 years because the trees that you replant are not growing in the same pattern and in the layer before you started this, but it's a place to start. And I always love the burning. People in Tallahassee hated it. My wife's from Tallahassee. By the way, where's my wife? Did she skip out? There she is. Thank you for staying. This is the main house at Pebble Hill, and one of the most beautiful rooms. They had this room painted specifically to display the birds that you can see around Pebble Hill. This is the main staircase, and some of we had 34 Audubon prints. I just knew they wouldn't miss one if I took them. Those are the dark years of my life in there where nobody knows where I was, serving time for taking the Audubons. The stables, which had been used as a cow barn, were turned into stables, but they were designed by Abram Garfield. You know, I said they knew everybody and were behind all the Republican politicians in Ohio. And Abram Garfield is the son of President Garfield. Their collections include Audubons by the boatload. They had enough dishes for the dining room to serve 3 meals a day for 7 days without the guest ever seeing the same plate twice. I don't know about you, that wouldn't be real important at our house, would it? The main house itself, as I said, burned in 1934, or I didn't tell you the time, but that is when it did. And shortly after that, Mrs. Ireland remarried, and she was divorced. Her first husband was I'm not going to go there. Let's just keep to the track here. This is the kitchen, one of my favorite rooms in the house. It has cork floors. It has cork floors. And they still use that stove to cook on, and the refrigerator, I wish was in the picture, but it has a monitor on top of it, you know, the motor on top. It looked just like you'd walked into a 19th century, turn of the century kitchen. Mrs. Harvey, as she became, took a great interest in not only building the cow barn, but building the dairy herd. She distributed cows all over the county during the Depression, trying to get people to take up dairy farming in the South instead of and giving way to cotton. And these are outside pictures of the cow barn. You can see the influence of Thomas Jefferson's style of architecture, the Georgian Christopher Wren influence. And let's see. This is the office building there. The upper right-hand building is the firehouse and nursing station. Mrs. Harvey was keen on developing the Visiting Nurses Association. In fact, her family is one of the founding families of it. And then below it on the right, if you look across the raised bed, you'll see a two-story house. That's the laundry. They washed every cloth on the plantation. Every member of the staff and family had their clothes done in that laundry because you were on duty 24/7. You didn't have time to wash clothes. Your duties were in the house. But that's only for 2 months out of the year, usually less. Just various images of Pebble Hill, but it's such a confusing complex of 34 that they would give their guests this map that you see in the upper right to show them how to get around and what they were looking at as they went. They had an artist there named Tex Wheeler for a while. He would come periodically and stay, and Tex would shock the guest by, he'd go for a morning walk in the morning with his cowboy hat on and nothing else. Mrs. Poe put up with, or Mrs. Hannah put up with him, and so did the daughter, Mrs. Poe. These are some of the lovely people I worked with, and the dignity of these people was just amazing to me. When you consider that what they have lived through and how they have relied on the plantation, they are dependent on that lifestyle. They do not have a house of their own. They have a house built for them there at Pebble Hill. The family to pay their medical expenses, which they did. That didn't happen in slavery, believe you me. If there was a promising child in one of the families there, may I call them black? My black friends just soon you call them black, so I don't know what is proper anymore. But if there was a promising child in a family, Mrs. Poe or Mrs. Ireland would see that they went to college and got an education. That circle of African Americans around Jimmy Carter, they mostly came off these plantations in South Georgia. Christmas, I just thought you'd enjoy this. It's a long way to Christmas again, but we used to buy 1,000 of these little poinsettia plants every year. And take this to heart. I never had one of them survive. But we would decorate the trees with lights and do all kinds of things. And that's me and my middle daughter, younger daughter, rather, Mary. And this is the house we lived in. First, the one in the upper left, which was not restored. That's the old guest house in Pebble Hill, Mr. Sparrow's residence. And that's architect Abram Garfield. And this other house is, this was built for the dairy master, Mr. McPherson, who had passed away before I got there. But they spent a fortune restoring that house just for us to live in. It was hard not to feel grateful every moment you were there. That is my son and my daughter. She's standing in there's a 90-foot long hallway. Right after World War I, they built a huge extension to the house. They had minted money during the war. The family says that. They didn't know what to do with all of it. And so that's the point at which I got interested in trying to tell their story, and I ran into a man, Hank Margison, who on a dirt road on the back part of the plantation, and he was sort of nice but surly. And so I walked up to him to speak to him and tell him, what in the hell are you doing here, boy? And no, I didn't. It crossed my mind. But Hank was a photographer, and we fell in together immediately. He was from Albany. he had documented all the plantations in Albany. There are only like 17 or 18 plantations around Albany. The soil is poorer there. It's a less desirable environment. I don't mean to apply that to the city, I hope you realize. But Hank was working on a photographic project. He was using an old wooden box camera, you know, like press corps used to use back in the 19th century. And he was nearing the end of it, and he said, I don't think I can write this book. I want you to do it for me. And so, you know, God bless me. I don't know how I lucked into that. But that's me in the upper right, hardly recognizable today. That's stuff on top of my head is hair. Well, that sort of concludes this. This will explain to you, those who work with me, why I wear quirky clothes sometimes, why I have a Labrador Retriever, why I'm always talking about the lure of the woods and hunting. But this is Peachy. This is Karen and I raised this dog. This dog slept in our room every night of its life. Well, I had a whole series of things to show you about people who owned plantations in Thomasville, Georgia. The John Hay family is one of them. I won't get into that, but his son-in-law was the Whitney, who owned the racing farm in Kentucky and was ambassador to England and married one of the Woolworth heiresses. One last thing. The first thing I heard, we were featured on America's Castles. We were one of the 8 or 9 places on America's Castles. And the photographers were there when I arrived. They had already started working on this project. And the house was all furnished, all organized, all like they wanted it to be when it opened. And the maid, who was the chief maid in the house, came to me and said, "You're sitting right where Mrs. Kennedy sat." She said when her husband was killed, she came and stayed at Greenwood Plantation as a retreat. And she used to ride over here on horseback and tie her horse up to these steps and visit with the family here, which that is an interesting insight. You know, I don't think Jack ever set foot on a horse, but his wife loved it. That's it.